Welcome everyone, and this is the lecture recording for week 8, and the topic this week is entitled The Neurophysiology of Movement. And as I've done in the past, I've got the lecture slides up in front of me and I'll just run through them as I go through the topic to make this recording. In particular with this particular lecture, there's not a huge amount of this content that's on the exam. So I'm just going to make sure that first of all it's not too long, and second of all too that we really point out to you exactly what's going to be sort of examinable, because I think it's just important for you to connect with it. There's a lot of stuff here you would have seen in previous units, a lot of it will be revision. It really just is some basic physiology and some neurophysiology really related to movement and different aspects of it. So I'm literally just going to go through the slides, go with it. Hopefully that will share with you all the information that's relevant for this particular unit. Now, in the introduction, we've got the neuromotor system, and what I've got on that first slide, there's a couple of YouTube clips that I want you to have a look at. They're in the slide there for you to go through. I'm not going to go through them now, but they just give you some really good ideas about the basic function of the neuromotor system, neurophysiology, and what's really relevant to exercise science or human movement. So just for that first slide, that introduction there, it talks about central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, and I think it's just a really important couple of YouTube clips that I would watch because it will really help explain what it is that we're trying to do here in this particular unit. So on the first slide there, we look at what's called the neuron, and that's the basic component of the nervous system. And really what you might need to know about the structure of the neuron is just how it works individually and as a team. So obviously there's a cell body, you've got the dendrites, you've got the axon, they're all on the slide there to look at, but really it's how the cells or the neurons actually talk to one another. So the dendrites, they're extensions from the cell body and they range from 1 to 1,000 per neuron. The axon, they're extensions for the cell body. There's only one per neuron with branches known as collaterals. And the axons are the ones that send the information from the neuron, where the dendrites are the ones that receive all the information. So it's just important to understand the different part of the actual neuron. There's one part of it that takes in information, travels along, and then it sends it from the other side as well. And that's almost like a sequence of reactions that continually occurs, hundreds of millions throughout the body. Every second, millisecond happens all the time. So that's a really basic understanding of the neuron. Then you've got the different types of neurons. So you've got the first one we look at is what's called our sensory neurons, and they're also known as afferent neurons. So it's important to understand those two terms, but you need to know that the sensory neurons are also called the afferent neurons, and they send information to the central nervous system from sensory receptors. So again, from your peripheral nervous system, they will send that information up to the central nervous system, the spine and the brain. The next one we look at is what's called the motor neurons, also called efferent. So MEN is an easy one to remember, I just try to remember motor neurons, efferent neurons, so MEN. And there's two main types of them, they're alpha and gamma, and they're the ones that send information from the central nervous system to the actual muscles or the peripheral nervous system as well. So they're the two main types that we look at. But then the third one is called the interneurons, and that's probably, they're the most in the human body. So there's more interneurons than there are any other sort of types of neurons, but they're specialized neurons that originate and terminate in the brain or spinal cord, and they sort of function as connections between the sensory and the motor nervous system. So just remember, afferent is to the central nervous system, efferent is from the central nervous system, so motor, efferent, MEN, and the interneuron is within the central nervous system. So they're really the three main types of neurons that we talk about, and they'll be directly related to maybe some multiple choice exam questions. We then look at the structure of the actual brain, and again, we're not going to have a detailed neuroanatomy lecture, because I couldn't give that because I'm not that informed when it comes to other people in this kind of area, especially those specialists that you probably hear over the next sort of month, especially with Laura and her information. But really when it comes down to the important context that we try to deliver this information to you is this, that the brain has different components and they all have different roles, but they also all talk to one another. So I know it sounds really obvious, but it's important to understand that. So the four main lobes that we look at within the brain are the temporal, the parietal, the occipital, and the frontal lobe. And a lot of our stuff happens with movement, happens in the frontal lobe, with more recent last 10 years looking at more the parietal lobe and some of the emotional contents of the brain that actually relate directly to movement or decision making, etc. So the frontal lobe we'll have a look at in about 3 slides with some specific areas related to movement and exercise science. So that really looks at the brain, that slide. You've got your ventral, which is obviously the front, and the dorsal at the back. And your dorsal is where that occipital lobe is, so almost right at the back here. The occipital lobe for vision, that's sort of the old eyes in the back of your head. That's how I remember it. So I know it sounds silly, but they're the kind of things that always stick with me. You've got your lateral sulcus there as well, longitudinal and central sulcus as well. So, but you don't need to know too much about those just at this point in time. So we know with the cerebrum, where all the good stuff happens, they're connected by that corpus callosum, which is the bit that connects the two hemispheres together. You've got your right hemisphere and your left hemisphere. The main important thing to understand here is not necessarily the ridges and the grooves of the actual cerebrum. It's just to understand the different cells. So we've got pyramidal cells and non-pyramidal cells, and the important aspect of that is that when we talk about, our right brain controlling our left side and our left brain controlling our right side, we talk about the pyramidal cells. They're the ones that cross over at certain types of the brain pathways, which we'll talk about in the last 2 slides. But the non-pyramidal cells don't cross over. So they have really specialist roles, and it can be in things like, not necessarily specifically, but things like postural control and those sorts of things, which aren't really driven by one side to the other. They're more centrally driven and more related to things like non-pyramidal cells. But you won't be asked that in the exam. It's just good to have an understanding of why we put it in the slide and why we need to distinguish between the two of them. So we've got our 4 lobes, which are named, and they're named really anatomically according to the nearest skull bone, which was named after them. So that's where the name comes from. And the main point of that is we know that they all have different functions. Now, also, like I said before, is you've got your 4 main lobes, but you've also got associative areas. So they're adjacent to their specific areas, and they all may play helping out roles as well. So an example here might be, I've got this slide here, so it's slide number 10, and I've got here is associative areas, the location adjacent to specific sensory areas of the sensory cortex. Function, to associate information from the several different sensory cortex areas, and it allows the interaction between perceptual and higher order cognitive functions. So really, that just says that these associative areas allow different parts of the brain to talk to one another to make decisions, to make correct responses. So they don't do it in isolation, they do it together. It says possible locations for transition between perception and action. And we talked about that in vision. Vision's a really unique thing that we look at, pardon the pun, didn't mean that. But we look at vision, we have a perceptual visual stream and we have an action visual stream. And I said you that in the past too. We looked at vision a couple of weeks ago. I think it actually might have been last week. And even anatomically and functionally, we have 2 different visual systems. And the research has shown that even the way that each of the visual systems interacts with the spinal cord is very different. Some at the front and some at the back, and there's the difference between perception and action. And we see it with people that have brain damage, that they can identify objects but don't know how to use it, or they can use objects but they can't actually identify what they've been called. So it just gives you a really good indication of the brain and how it works together, and this understanding between, or the talking between perception, so identifying, and acting to actually do something is really what we talk about when it comes to human movement or exercise science. So that's why that example's in there on slide number 10. So then we have a look at the next slide, and that just highlights the main areas of the frontal cortex that we really look at, the frontal lobe of the central cortex. Here we've got, the main ones we look at is the primary motor cortex, the supplementary motor area, and the premotor cortex. So they're the 3 main areas of the brain, as well with different parts of the parietal lobe, that really come down to us making, executing, and giving feedback on all our movement decisions that we try to attempt to do. And so that's just a nice way for you to see visually whereabouts a lot of this information is happening. So we talk about things like reaction time, movement time, cognitive function. We're really talking about this area here of the brain that really helps us with movement, which is really interesting. Okay, so we've got the primary motor cortex, so we're now at slide number 12, and that's just going through Really what I've just spoken about there is the three different parts of that frontal lobe. You're not going to need to identify in the exam the three different parts and what they're for and what particular movements they're for or not for. But it's really good information in slides 12, 13 and 14 for you to have for your own knowledge and for your own thoughts. So I'm not going to literally go through each of those because you can read and go through them and they're not going to necessarily be examinable in that way. Slide number 15 also just tells you about parietal lobe, which I said we now know interacts with those three aspects of the brain, which I've just mentioned before: premator cortex, primary motor cortex, and supplementary motor area before and during movement. So that's more recent. When I say recent, more the last sort of 10 years, but that's really come into place now that, that this part of the parietal lobe is involved as well, which is, again, really interesting to find out. Now, the next slide we look at here, and this deals more with looking at refining movements and looking at different types of dysfunction that can occur within us, especially when it comes to movement. And we've got this area of the brain called the basal ganglia, and it's buried within the cerebral hemispheres, and within it has four, some people argue five, but we're going to go with four large nuclei, and you can see their names there. Now, this is slide number 16 we're at the moment, and the really one that we look at is called substantia nigra, and that has a lot to do with people that have things like Parkinson's disease, which I'll go through in the next slide. And again, too, that's a nice little question we like to ask you in exam as well. So next slide we look at there, we have Parkinson's disease, and it's a common disease associated with basal ganglia dysfunction, and it really comes down to a lack of a hormone called dopamine that's produced in that nuclei, which I said before, which is called substantia nigra, and that's because not enough dopamine being produced, and therefore we have this dysfunction with Parkinson's disease, which really is about trembling, not being able to refine movement. And it's also related to this slide, in slide number 17, sorry, the bit underneath it called those four different things we look at, rigidity and tremor. But you guys will go through a bit more of that in weeks 10, 11 and 12 in relation to gait and refining gait, etc. as well. So again, just good for you guys to know. Now, the next slide here, number 18, the only reason I put this slide in here is because I think it's really important to try to look at the brain from different levels and to understand that, yes, we're looking at things like decision making and movement, all those things, but it's really important for us to understand the different other aspects of the brain that we just take for granted. And a lot of that I've spoken about before with the thalamus and the hypothalamus about regulation. We also look at things like if we look at the amygdala, which is there in this slide number 18 now, the amygdala is one I've mentioned before, and I find it really interesting because it's that emotional part of the brain. And so a lot of times too, our brain is built to, when we see fear or danger, so when we see danger, fear is released and hormones are released from that amygdala for us to be careful, to stop, to try to avoid the situation, or flight or fight, as we know, and that's all happens in the amygdala. What's really interesting and stuff, it's more, again, I say the word more recently too much, but more recently there's been a lot of work on people with chronic pain, and people with chronic pain have really big flashes up here in the amygdala in functional MRI. So their amygdalas are really big and large compared to what it would normally be like, because they're constantly in fear, because they have this centrally driven pain mechanism. So therefore they're fearful of everything all the time, which therefore perpetuates more pain, because the body thinks, or the brain thinks, they're in trouble, so it perpetuates it again. And they get in this constant cycle. And that's one of the really hardest thing for a lot of practitioners to work on, is people with chronic pain, especially one without, I guess, a clinical reason for it that they can find. A lot of it can come down to a dysfunction with the central nervous system. So again, so it's just really good information to know. We also know that short-term memory, so the working we went through last week and how it works with long-term memory, that sort of happens in this limbic system, emotional system as well. And also too, we've got things like the limbic system for cardiovascular, body temp and sleep and emotional responses as well. So again, I know I've said this a few times already, that's not going to be in the exam per se, but I still think it's really critical that we identify that that's parts of the brain's function that we need to at least understand. Right, we then go to the central nervous system. We look at the different parts of the spine, and you guys have gone through this a number of times in anatomy, so this is not something that we need to go through step by step. We know we've got cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and different parts of the spine that you would have known from, and sort of the sacral part of the spine as well. So you've gone through that before in your anatomy, so I'm not going to go through that bit by bit now. In slide number 20, we've got the central nervous system, look at more the ventral and the dorsal aspect of the spine, looking at the white matter and the grey matter as well. And again, it's just a nice little slide that you cut across to see the different parts of the brain. So the dorsal aspect is more to do with sensory, and ventral aspect is to do with motor. So same thing with the action perception of vision, the same thing here we have. So the dorsal aspect of the spinal cord, that's more to do with sensory information, and then that's transferred to your interneurons, also called your ventral cells in the middle here, and then they pass that information on to the ventral aspect, the front of the spinal cord, and that's your motor part, which obviously provides information to do a function and provides some information back up through those efferent pathways to the central nervous system. So that just gives you a nice little look of how that information actually works. And the next slide here, so slide number 21, is just exactly what I just described then. Okay, so the transfer or the transmitting information from dorsal to ventral via the interneurons called your ventral cells as well, in the ventral part of the spinal cord. Right, so the last little bit we look at here, so it's only another couple more minutes of this particular lecture, but really what we want to look. Okay, so we now look at the next slide. So we're at slide number 22 now, and that's entitled Sensory Neural Pathways. So there's several different neural tracks that we look at here, but they're all called, when it comes to sensory neural pathways, they're called ascending tracks. So when you think about two, ascending tracks just means information from the senses, for the sensory nervous system, that send information back up to the central nervous system. So they're called your afferent pathways, so sensory. They pass through the spinal cord and brainstem, and they connect to the sensory areas of the cerebral cortex and the cerebellum. We mainly look at, for motor control, we mainly look at two main tracks, which is called the dorsal column and the anterolateral system. So they're the main ones we look at. But again, too, for exam, you won't have to identify those particular ones, but we'll just look at the last two slides so you can see how they actually work. So if we look at the next slide here, we've got the motor neural pathways, and they're called the descending tracks. So efferent pathways, information coming from the central nervous system to the actual muscles themselves, that's the motor, so to actually initiate the action, while the sensory ones get feedback, sensory system back up to the brain. So the motor neural pathways are called the descending tracks, and they travel from the brain through the spinal cord. Now, I mentioned before about the pyramidal cells. So we have pyramidal tracks, and they're about 60% from the motor cortex, and most fibres cross to the other side in the medulla part of the brainstem, and that's called. When we look at how that actually works, we look at where it actually crosses out. So it crosses over at the medulla oblongata, and that's part of the brainstem where the actual cells cross over from maybe the right hemisphere to the left side, or from the left hemisphere to the right side. Whereas the non-pyramidal tracks, they stay mainly in the brainstem, they don't cross over. And like I said before, they're mainly to do with refining things like posture, and it says here control of hand and finger flexion extension, so more refining of movements or postural control as well. So we want to know really what happens from what we call this next slide here, which is 24. So from intent to action. So think about the entire process of deciding to perform a motor skill and actually performing it. So the neural activity involved in this process typically follows a hierarchical organisation pattern from higher to lower levels of the neuromuscular system. So the last two slides we look at is just some examples visually of how it actually works. So if you look at here, slide number 25, we've got information from the motor cortex, and the letters here UMN to stand for upper motor neuron, whereas down the bottom here we've got LMN, which is just a lower motor neuron. And so here you've got examples of the information being passed from the brain, so down, so descending down, right? And they cross over here at the medulla oblongata, which is in the middle there, you can see where it crosses over, and it travels to what's called the lateral corticospinal tract. And that then gets information to the skeletal muscles. So that's your ascending track. So the important information there is that there's an upper motor neuron and a lower one, and they cross over at this midline, like I said, at the medulla, and that there's two different types of lower motor neurons as well. Right, so for the last one, we look at the central nervous system. We look at information that's going back up, so what we call ascending. So sensory information going back from the peripheral nervous system back up to the brain, so what's called your ascending tract, or your efferent, so sensory efferent fibres. So here we've got information that goes up again, the lateral spinal thalamic tract, and again you can see where it sort of goes all the way up and back up to the sensory cortex. You can see in that previous slide as well, it's important to understand that you can see the ones that cross over. We said in the slide before, most of the ones that cross over are ones that are motor neurons. So in that slide number 25, the previous slide again, keep in mind that that's the motor neurons, and they're your alpha and your gamma neurons, and 60% of them cross over to perform an action. We look at, again, slide number 26, you can see there's not that crossover with the sensory cortex as much as it is with the motor ones. But again, you won't have to describe that in the exam situations. This there to show you the different pathways, and you would have gone in much more detail in previous units anyway, I'm sure, especially in your exercise science 293, for those that still having a few nightmares about that. But you would have gone through it in much more detail. So for this particular lecture, the take-home message is really just understand the really basic parts of your brain, the basic parts of their function. You're likely to get maybe a couple of 2-mark questions to try and describe the pathway of a neuron, so know your motor and your sensory different systems, and you might get a few multiple choice questions on the structure of the actual cells or the neurons themselves as well. Alright, so it should be about 20 minutes all up for this one, and yeah, hopefully you guys are busy doing your assignments this week and you're almost done and ready to hand them in, and that's what I'll be busy marking next week. So you'll have Laura next week, next Monday for what will be week 9, so 9, 10, 11, 12, but I'm still obviously going to be around, so if you need anything, just give us a yell, and like I said, I'll be busy marking your awesome videos. I'm sure that I'll just be up all night, just can't keep your eyes off them because I'll be that good, and I'm sure we will all be getting really good marks. So that's the plan. So yeah, good luck in the last week of putting those together, and yeah, hopefully this was informative as always. All right, see you guys. Bye.